Before we start going over textures in Map Maker, I want to just briefly show you how I delineate my roads using paint.net. First, I've copied terrainmap.bmp over into a working folder. I've loaded it up into paint.net, and the first thing I want to do is set my overwrite on, and then I want to make sure that anti-aliasing is disabled. You can set these as defaults in paint.net by the toolbar, choose defaults, and then here toward the bottom of the screen you can set these as your defaults and then save them. Before I start drawing my road network, I'm going to add a layer. It's easy that way to correct your mistakes. You can simply go in and delete the layer and start fresh. Since our map has some pretty dark areas here in the forest areas, I'm going to go ahead and use a lighter color for delineating the roads. I'll be using the line tool here in paint.net to delineate the roads. For this main road, I'm going to set the width of the line to be about 7 pixels. And I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here to get a better view at the road. I'll pick a point right through here and then drag it on down, and I've now created a nice straight line segment of the road. While we're in paint.net, we'll go ahead and delineate the smaller roads as well, and set them at a slightly narrower width. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do the farm lane too. I think I'm going to use a different color in case I decide I want to use a different texture. So I go ahead and pick another color for the farm lane, set it to maybe 3 pixels wide because it's certainly going to be a bit smaller. Go ahead and set my line tool, and then I'll draw the lane in, and you can see it has some handles, so I'm able to curve the lane a little bit here to match what the image shows. And that's how we delineate a farm lane. Once you have all your roads and lanes delineated, you want to go back in and save the file. I like to save it as a paint.net to start with in case I want to come back in and do some additional work with it. So go File, Save As, and go ahead and give it a name, and make sure that we're saving it as a paint.net. When that's done, in order to use the image in Map Maker, we need to have a BMP, so I go back in, I save again, but I now choose BMP, save the file. Go ahead and accept the defaults during these save routines, and you'll need to flatten it to get rid of the extra layer, and that's all there is to it. Once we finished working on our map, I saved it as terrainmap.bmp in a working directory, and then I copied it over to my media/Nicolino directory. I started Map Maker, and since Nicolino map is a 1,000 meter map, I can accept the default and press enter. In the lower left hand corner, I want to load Nicolino. Remember that I could have used this button and browsed for the map, but since I know the name, I'll go ahead and type it and press enter. In the rest of this tutorial, I'm going to show you the basics of texturing your map. If you think of textures as the paint that you use to paint your map onto the screen, textures don't change the way your map behaves, but it does change the way it looks. In this tutorial, I'm going to explain the default textures, and then we will go ahead and apply some textures to our road network and paint the road network onto our map. Map Maker comes with a set of base default textures that all maps have. You can't delete these textures, but you can make some modifications to them. For this map, I'm going to go ahead and accept the defaults for most of these, but not all of them. The first texture is the sky mat texture. This is the texture that gets painted on the outside of the map area. You usually want this texture to look somewhat similar to the predominant texture on your map, so that when you're looking at the horizon, you can see a similar type of a texture. I'm going to come back to the terrain texture in a minute, but let's skip on down to the wall texture. This is the texture that gets drawn onto the vertical sides of your map. You can try some different textures out here, but I'm going to go ahead and leave this at the default. If you had water on your map, this is the default water texture that would be applied. The water texture is actually unique in that we can use its properties to set how fast water flows, because water can be animated in Panzer Command. There's some other attributes as well. We don't have any water on this tutorial map, so we'll save that for another session. Let's go ahead and go back to the terrain texture. This may be the most important texture on your map. This is the texture that covers the entire map, and all the other textures overlay this texture. If you go to apply a different texture to a color, this is the texture that color will get. I want to select a different texture to use for my terrain texture, so I click on the Browse Folders button. You can see the folders that we have available to select from. I'm going to go into the grass folder, and I think for our Nicolino map, I want to use the grass 2 for my texture. I also want to change some of the properties for this texture. The texture patch by default is set to repeat 50 times across the map. So for a 1,000-meter map, this texture patch is repeated every 20 meters. And that's what the X and the Y values mean. I'm going to change this to a 10 by 10 grid. And this should stretch the texture out. And once you make a change to the texture, you need to click on the check mark to commit that change. You can try various settings for this texture and select the ones that you like, but I'm also going to customize my texture itself, and I'll do that in a moment. Note that if this were a water texture where you put water as part of the name, the X value would actually set how fast the water moves, and the Y value would set the size of the waves that you have in your animated water. The next parameter is rotation. Some textures, like plow furrows, have a directionality to them, and this is where you set the direction. Note that if this was a water texture, this setting would actually control the direction that the water flows. For the blur value, I'm going to leave this at the default setting. And the opacity, which is the next parameter, I'm also going to leave this at the default setting. Now I want to go ahead and make just a small customization to this texture. So I come over here, I click on the texture patch, and you can see some of the parameters that you can change here. You can set the blur, you can change the lightness of the color, you can also change the saturation and the hue of the color. For this tutorial, I'm going to keep it pretty simple, and I'm just going to change the blur value to 1. And I think I'll go ahead and set the lightness, make this a little bit lighter, and set this to, or a little bit darker, and change the lightness to -5. By going a minus, this will make it a little bit darker green. And I'll say OK. You'll notice a pencil mark here appears whenever you have a modified texture. Normally I wouldn't build the map yet, but let's go ahead so that we can see what the map looks like before we begin applying any of our own textures to the map. To build a map in Map Maker, you go down toward the bottom. In the left pane, you can find the Build the Map button. This also saves our files, of course. And since I already have a name entered for this map, I simply click on the button.